Thank you all for coming. I'm going to say just a very few words. I'm not going to try and take up too much of the time because I know you didn't come for me. You came for the man to my right. This is the second in the series of public events on pluralism and plurality in Islamic cultures, co-produced by the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, held here all in the Aga Khan Center. As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, both AKU-ISMC and AKTC, I'm jumping straight into the acronyms here, are themselves part of a larger Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN. Each branch of AKDN, in its own unique way, aspires to bring about positive change in the world. The AKDN mission, right, broadly ribbed. AKU carries out research and education across a globally distributed university and seeks to address inequalities both now and into the future, in part through guiding future leaders. AKTC, as we'll learn more this evening, understands that people exist in social and physical contexts. The people have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt to a hugely diverse range of contexts and adapt those contexts, and they are themselves transformed by the places in which they live. People create their built environments, their cities, their towns, their houses, their workspaces. And in turn, they are transformed and in a sense recreated by those spaces individually and collectively, particularly through the interaction with their environments. Saif's talk tonight will look at the roles that public spaces play in enabling community interaction in historic cities of the Islamic world, and the roles played by such places today in bringing new life into those cities. Comparing past and present, public, semi-public, the talk looks at different forms of engagement in different cities, reflecting on inclusiveness, the role of community, and the multiplicity of use across time. It is a real honor to have Seif El Rashidi. His expertise in urban conservation, heritage management, interpretation, engagement around the history of art and architecture are exemplary. He is truly an impressive individual. He's currently the project manager for the Layers of London, which enables public engagement with London's heritage through knowledge sharing. He's also the director of the Barakat Trust. Saif previously managed the Magna Carta program at Salisbury Cathedral and place my old home, the Durham World Heritage Site. Prior to that, he worked for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture's Historic Cities program and for Ahmad Hamid Architects, both in Cairo. Saif has lectured and written about the preservation of historic cities in a wide range of contexts and has been a guest lecturer on Durham University's International Heritage Management Master's degree since 2012. So it is my immense pleasure and privilege to hand over to the person you've actually come to listen to tonight. Seif El Rashidi will now help us better understand public space and community in historic cities of the Islamic world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. When I put together the title and came to start preparing the lecture, I thought, oh, I was very ambitious in what I proposed to do in 45 minutes, but I'll try. So the first slide in front of you is something which I thought would challenge you a bit in thinking about public space in a historic city in the Islamic world, because this slide probably doesn't look like a historic city or the Islamic world, but actually it's both. This is a public space in Kazan in Tatarstan, which is 50% of the population is Muslim, and it has a very ancient and significant Muslim history. And one of the projects that's been carried out throughout Tatarstan, not just in Kazan, the capital, has been to convert derelict spaces into active public space. And as many of the examples I'll show today are parks, I thought it would be good to start with something that isn't a park, so that it doesn't seem as if I'm talking about gardens, but about public space in general and its uses, and the way it can transform communities and bring them together. And this example of people enjoying this public space by the lake in Kazan is a good example. This was just a wasteland on the side of the lake before. So I thought I'd start with history. And one good example of an important Muslim city is Al-Mansur's Baghdad, founded in the 8th century as an ideal city, a magnificent city. And you find that throughout not only the history of the Islamic world, but throughout history, that at periodic points rulers think, well, we're sick of our old capital with all its problems, let's start by building something new. And then Mansur, the caliph, decided that his ideal thing would be a round city with 4 gates, walls, a market within the city walls, and a palace, and a mosque in the center. And there isn't much left of it. There's hardly anything left of it. We have descriptions, but this is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. And as you can imagine, as many people building new cities across the ages have stood back and looked, Mansour was very proud of his achievement. However, the Byzantine ambassador came to visit Baghdad and was shown this new city by the Caliph. And the Caliph asked him what he thought. The Byzantine ambassador said, oh, well, you've built a city like no other. We've never seen anything like it. But it has 3 defects. The first defect is it doesn't have enough water. And it only has enough water to touch people's lips. People need more water. The second defect is it doesn't have any gardens. And people love gardens. And the eye likes to see greenery. And the third defect is you've put the markets within the city walls and they'll bring outsiders and they'll be able to steal your secrets. Obviously, the Caliph didn't really like this critique and said, well, we don't really need water. The water that is enough to touch our lips is enough for us. Secondly, this is a serious city. We don't really care about parks for people to play around in and recreation. And thirdly, I have no secrets, so I don't care if people come in close to the palace or within the city walls. This is the way I govern. But after the Byzantine ambassador left, the Caliph thought about it and realized that actually he was right. And so he ordered people to build 2 canals, bringing water into the city. He identified an island on the Tigris and converted it into a park. And thirdly, he moved the markets outside the city walls somewhere else. And I think water is an essential part of cities and public space, but I think this reflection on recreational space and commercial activity has always been something true to the notion of what we're thinking about when we're talking about public space. And I thought this was a good example that summed it up. So I won't tell you the quote. You don't have to read the quote, even if I told you. But classically, when we think of Islamic cities, we might think of big public spaces like this one in the entrance of Sana'a in Yemen, where there's commercial activity, cafes, it's bringing people together, which is what public spaces do. Sorry. Well, this other slide of Kazan in Morocco is I wanted to show you the difference between cities that have evolved organically over time, and look at the seemingly higgledy-piggledy street pattern with an area like this, which is regular and you can see has been planned. Actually, even in the seemingly higgledy-pigglediness of historic cities, there is an order. And the order usually includes spaces like the public square in Sana'a, little clearings, which might bring a neighborhood together, and long commercial streets and small dead-end alleyways. And I think that's true of medieval cities. And it's one thing that's definitely true of cities in the Islamic world is that the idea of privacy is more important. And so often there are public spaces and there are semi-public spaces, which are sometimes these little clearings that bring 2 or 3 alleyways together and are used by the residents of a place that might not be used by anyone else. One of the things that studies of historic cities in the Islamic world tend to show is that these semi-public spaces or spaces where people, including especially women, are comfortable to go out of their house and in clothes that they'd never be seen in a public square like the one I showed you in Sana'a. So it's semi-public because it's not part of your house, but all the people that use it are people that you feel comfortable enough with, that they can see you in your nightgown or your robe or whatever. And I think if you look at how these spaces function in cities in the Islamic world, they're not always physical boundaries that separate the commercial street from the semi-private public space. They're often like the street narrows and you walk through a narrow bit and it becomes wider and you realize, usually because people have asked you or looked at you in a certain way, that you've entered a semi-private, semi-public zone. So I don't think it's just public and private. There are also these gray areas which are very important to the functioning of a city. This is one of them. Where do you think this is? It's not the most amazingly clear image, but Can anyone guess where in the Islamic world this is? Someone guess. Sorry?
Nigeria.
No, actually Saudi Arabia.
Oh.
And I thought this one is an example of, even in the places where you imagine privacy to be of the, well actually where privacy is of the utmost importance, you still find that there are some residential enclaves which have this space which maybe 3 families will use and no one else, but it's a kind of shared public space. Most of these plants are artificial, by the way. And in thinking of public space, we often think of planned public spaces like the Caliph in Baghdad saying, okay, I'm going to create a park because the Byzantine ambassador was right. But also, public space has a way of appearing and of being appropriated by people seizing the opportunity to find a space to mingle and to do things. And I thought this reference from Cairo from 1506 was a good one, that because the Nile was low, a mudflat appeared, and suddenly the people thought, oh, this is good, we have this public space we've never had before. They planted all these fragrant plants and cucumbers and things, and splashed around in complete abandon. And I took, this isn't Cairo, this is Granary Square, 5 minutes away from here. I mean, there's no one splashing around today, but if you come on a summer's day, it's very similar to the account of Cairo in 1506. In 1507, the same thing happened in Cairo. Public space appeared in the same place, and people said that they were there not kind of enjoying themselves until the middle of the night with nothing to worry about. And actually, if you look at public spaces and how they're used, one of the things that they function most effectively for is places where people have leisure time that can be doing nothing or just wandering around with their family or just reflecting. One of my colleagues at the University of London has a project of putting diaries in Russell Square, vacant, empty diaries where people can write notes. And one thing is they never seem to be vandalized, and secondly, people seem to write the same sorts of things. And public space is a place for reflection, as well as community activity. And I think that's true not only of Britain, but also of cities in the Islamic world, that people use them in the same ways. This is one of the greatest public spaces in a historic city in the Islamic world, Isfahan, developed by Shah Abbas in the end of the 16th century, not only with great buildings, but also great public spaces. And the reference of many big public spaces, especially green spaces, is always, I would say, or not, is often the paradise, 4 gardens and rivers, and you find that this is something that inspires designers and patrons throughout the history of the Islamic world. When you look at the accounts of Shah, or the contemporary accounts of people reflecting on the public space of Shah Abbas's Isfahan in the 16th century and the very early 17th century, they usually independently say the same thing. Oh, it's so beautiful that now we believe that paradise must exist because Shah Jahan was able to show us that here are the tuba trees, which are supposed to be trees in paradise. Look at the tulips, look at the lilies. But one of the things they also say is that the proof of this ability to recreate paradise is that by creating this space, you have all these very attractive young people walking around smelling roses and flowers, and that the young people, or the kind of perfect humans which are supposed to inhabit paradise, appear here as well. So it's an interesting reflection of public space as the reflection of paradise, but also the confirmation that paradise must exist because we can create it on earth through these wonderful spaces. And this is an aerial view of Shah Abbas's Isfahan. And they talk about very specific things, not only these beautiful youths smelling trees and flowers, but also the fact that it creates shade for weary travelers and for poor people to rest in the arches of a bridge. And so there's an interesting idea about how public space caters to all segments of the community. And it's not only kings and kingship that leads to this kind of investment in public space for common good. We have many examples of people, inscriptions on buildings where they say, oh, we've created a garden as an endowment so that God's creations, i.e. man, can enjoy it. And there's this whole idea of how you can create this uplifting place, not just physically, but also to the spirit. A very interesting example of a non-garden public space which still exists is the Hippodrome in Istanbul, an ancient public space which is pre-Islamic but was used extensively and is still used in Turkey today. But in the 16th century, it was the festival ceremony of the circumcision of the Sultan's son. And one of the things they did was have a 50-day celebration of the guilds and all of the different people in the Sultan's kingdom, or Sultanate, I suppose, which involved all these processions in front of the Sultan who's sitting in this pavilion on the left. And as you might expect, it included tradespeople and merchants, and the accounts are very detailed about how it was a space where all these people came together. Some people used it to their advantage. For example, the coffee sellers, who were not very liked because people thought that coffee shops, all sorts of kind of dubious activities happened in coffee shops, impressed the Sultan very much with the model of the coffee house, and so he decided to like them after that. But also, I mean, there's great diversity, but it's not very clear, I'm afraid, but these are the street cleaners and the beggars. We're not begging and street cleaning, they're also part of the procession in front of the Sultan. And I think it's an affirmation of the fact that there was a recognition that through public space that everyone in society has a role to play, including the beggars and the street cleaners. There were fights when coins were distributed and food was distributed, but it didn't. No one said, oh, we have to remove all these terrible people out of the Sultan's way because this is an imperial event. It was more about how everyone has a place to play. And similarly, one thing to think about public space, which I think the Istanbul example is a good reminder of, is that it's a great venue for temporary things, that not everything will happen permanently. Sometimes you have festivals and occasions that require public space, and within a night they disappear and it becomes a much more tranquil place. But it is and has always been important for these moments when a large number of people need to come together to celebrate or to protest or to do various things. This I thought was interesting because this is actually inside the Great Mosque of Damascus. And the boys with the sticks are not fighting, they're playing. But one thing we tend to sometimes misunderstand is that spaces only have one role, that you think that the courtyard of a mosque is only for prayer or for religious activity, but actually it's much more liminal than that, that one space can have many different functions. And in fact, mosques, especially huge and important mosques like the Great Mosque of Damascus, always played this multiplicity of roles. And I remember the first time when I went to Damascus, I was really struck by the fact, as I walked into the courtyard, that there were all these families pushing their children in strollers and walking around the courtyard. And it was very clear that it was a pub, as well as being a mosque, the public space was a public space where people did recreational things and relaxed. And traditionally, this is the Damascus citadel. This is Suq al-Hamadiyya, the main commercial street. It leads to a clearing in which you can see what predated the mosque, the Temple of Jupiter, and more ancient buildings, and the mosque itself with its huge courtyard in comparison to the whole city of Damascus. And this is, I mean, I think it's a common practice, not only in the Islamic world, but in other places, to go somewhere bustling and then relax and reflect in a quieter, more reflective place. When I lived in Durham, you might be able to relate to it. People did the same with Durham Cathedral, that they'd go shopping on Saturday, like in Suq al-Hamadiyya, and then wander into the cathedral and spend a quiet half hour just relaxing and reflecting. So this is the clearing at the end between Suq al-Hamadiyya and the Great Mosque, when you can see people just kind of chatting, waiting, because public space is not just about activity, it's also about places where you can be inactive. Yeah, as we move, the second part of my presentation is really about interventions in public space and some initiatives to do things. And one of the things that is really important in interventions in public space is understanding how they function and understanding how communities use space and the nature of certain spaces, and making the distinction between commercial streets like this one in the walled city of Lahore, so bigger spaces that the community would congregate, and quiet residential alleys of the type that I told you about, where if you walk in, people might question whether you've got lost or whether you're going somewhere, who you're visiting, etc. They might ask you, are you looking for someone in particular? And so most good public or urban regeneration schemes somehow try to understand the patterns of a city and respect those patterns. And I think it's also important to think in the context of the Islamic world that most so-called Muslim cities are never or hardly ever entirely Muslim, and there's an interesting interrelationship between Muslim majorities and non-Muslim minorities. And if you look, for example, at the Medina and Fez, there was an interesting mutual benefit in the Jewish quarter of a Muslim city, which is that Muslims could do non-Muslim things in the Jewish quarter without being really held accountable. So, for example, you could drink or go and get alcohol, and Jews could leave the Jewish quarter and do things, for example, do things on the Sabbath that they wouldn't be able to do in the Jewish part of the city. So there's this reliance and a freedom that comes from having a multi-religious, sometimes multi-ethnic city, which is exemplified, I would say, in the way the Medina, the Jewish quarter in cities like Fez functioned. That's not to say they were perfect or that it was wonderful. That's not what I'm trying to argue at all, but it does have social benefits that might not be immediately obvious. And here's a photo of the entrance to the Jewish quarter of Fez. This rock that you can see in the background is in fact one of the strangest public spaces I've ever come across because it's so inaccessible. This is Tula, a historic city in Yemen, and the rock, when it rains heavily as it does in Yemen periodically, the water percolates inside this giant rock, trickles through the rock and appears in a pool at the bottom. And so the community of Tula is sustained by this water source that is quite remarkable in a way. And here's the pool on the day when it rains. So it's quite a large pool. It's not a very large settlement, but it is a really old one that they found the remains of really ancient temples built to the god of water, or a god of water. This is what the city looks like, or the town looks like, hugging around this rocky outcrop. And a few years ago, there was a scheme to improve access to the top of the hill, of what they call a ford, but actually it's a fortified hill. And the whole thing was done through community labor. I mean, all the labor was local. They got local funding from the municipality. And given the topography of the site, what they did is they just passed stones up from one worker to the next, all the way up to repave the steps and the pathways. And I was very surprised when I finally got to the top that there were lots of old people walking around. And I said, well, I mean, isn't it, what are these people doing here? And they said, oh, well, it's part of our tradition and our culture that we come up in the evenings and we just enjoy the view. And I said, yeah, but some of the people walking around seem quite elderly. And they said, the man told me, yes, they are, but they've been doing this all their lives, and so they're fit enough as a result of going up these 800 steps every day to be able to do it. So we tend to think of public space as the square in the middle of a city or a town or open spaces between buildings, but sometimes, as is the case in Tula in Yemen, it can be a kind of, it requires energy to get there, but it isn't only treadmills and things that fulfill that function. It can be a rocky outcrop in a traditional village or town in Yemen. A project that I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about is Muharraq in Bahrain, which was historically the capital and thrived until the 1930s when the pearling industry collapsed. This was the center of the pearl trade in the Gulf. And when the cultured pearl was invented in the 30s, no one wanted natural pearls anymore, so this area became impoverished and many people eventually deserted it, which was actually a good thing from the historic city's point of view because it meant that they didn't build new buildings then, they built elsewhere. So it's well preserved, and over the past 15 years the Bahraini government has invested money in restoring the old buildings and also creating much better public spaces. The way they've been able to do that is by creating small public squares in areas where historic buildings once stood and were demolished. And as you can imagine, the socioeconomic profile of this area has changed over time. It's become poorer and its residents have changed. So it has lots of migrant workers, many of whom share houses and live in, like they rent a room in a house. And so you find that one house that traditionally would have housed the Bahraini family now has, say, 8 migrant workers that they refer to them as bachelors. And so part of this scheme was not only to restore the buildings and use them for cultural activities and other things, but also to think about how the public space could serve its community. This is just an indication of, I mean, it's quite an extensive project. This is the island of Muharraq. These are pearl beds that still survive, a couple of them still survive. And all of the red areas or nodes of buildings that have been restored and public spaces, which in many cases have been created in the last 10 years or so. And they also have some public buildings which are really interesting. This is a music hall, but it's designed in a way that it has a screen that you can lift and pull down. So if you want, if the community decides that it wants to listen to a concert that's going on, they can pull the screen up and it's more audible. If someone's practicing, then they pull the screen down and the community is sheltered from noise pollution in public space. So this is what it looks like from the inside. So they're squares of not very large, but one of the things they do is they create a leisure space for people who don't have extensive amounts of money and who might not meet each other otherwise, that often you might work somewhere and go into your house or your room and never encounter the neighbor. So these small neighborhood spaces are really effective in terms of enabling community meetings and also providing people who don't really have public space, or who don't have, they might not have a living room in their house to have the space to talk on the phone or call their family or whatever. And I think that's quite important, that sometimes public space provides very basic needs, but people really appreciate what it enables them to do, just to sit on their own and not have to listen to the television or be distant from one's housemates once in a while. So, here's another view of people when I'm texting. This project, which I worked on for a long time, and which I always have to resist talking a lot about, is Al Azhar Park in Cairo, which was created on the site of a former rubbish dump of the Medina city. The reason it's hilly is not a natural hill, it's rubbish being thrown out of the city walls for 500 or 600 years. And the idea of Barakat Trust for Culture in this project was to use this dump site to create a public park and to use this investment in public space to try and improve the historic quarter overlooking what was then a dump site and is now a park. This is a view from the 90s of what it would have been like. The houses overlooking the dump site were the poorest people who obviously blocked their windows on that side. Today, it's one of the nicest views in Cairo. This is what it looks like today. But it was a very interesting experience to think about what kind of people used the park when it was new and what kind of people use it today. With new things, everyone wants to discover them, especially when they're large scale and impressive like Al Azhar Park. And in the early 2000s when it opened, all sorts of people from all walks of life would go to Al Azhar Park. I would say that more recently, or once the initial excitement wore away, it became more of a park for people who wanted to spend leisure time without spending lots of money. And that's something that you can do in public space that you can't do in many other places. One of my friends took her grandmother to see it, and she said, oh, this is all, everyone here is in love with someone else, that it's all full of couples holding hands and sitting on benches and things. And in fact, it is a beautiful place in that respect, that you can sit and admire the flowers, and it is popular among young courting couples in Egypt. Its popularity, judging by the number of people who visit it every year, attests to the fact that this kind of space is really important and that there isn't much of it in cities like Cairo. So I don't think it's bad that the more affluent Egyptians don't go there as often as they did in 2003 or 2004. I think in a way, well, it was always intended to be a lung for the city, but also for the local community, and the fact that it's an attractive place for people who want to spend 8 hours together but don't want to have to buy 3 meals in a restaurant. I think that's one of its successes. Yeah, actually, when I was looking at my computer, I found this letter which I'd forgotten about, that in the early, whenever the park opened in 2004, I think, some school groups came to visit, and one school group, they wrote about their experience. And we collected the letters from that group, and this one struck me because the girl says, this is the happiest day in my tired and sad life. And so I was discussing with one of my colleagues, and I said, oh, I'm sure a child didn't write that. It must be an adult pretending to be a child. Why would the child say that they had a tired and sad life? So we sat and discussed it, and then, because there's a phone number at the top, something that probably never happened in England, we decided to call the girl and ask her. So we called, and it was a female colleague of mine, and she said, may I speak to Farah, please? And I think her mother answered, and then Farah came to the phone, and we said, oh, well, we really liked your letter about Al-Azhar Park, but can you tell us why you wrote it was the happiest day in your tired and sad life? And she said, oh, well, I didn't have a good day at school that day, and then going to the park and seeing all these lovely flowers and made me forget the early part of the day. So I realized that A, I was wrong, but B, it was a good example of the kind of effect that a successful public space can have. And it doesn't have to be a huge park with fountains and lakes and palm trees. It can sometimes be a small, relaxing space. Part of our work in Historic Cairo was also to work with the community to think about how to improve urban spaces within the heart of the historic neighborhood. And I think that's the challenging thing, that we often think, oh, the community, everyone likes each other, but actually they do to some extent. But there's an Arabic saying that it's me and my brother against my cousin, and my cousin and I against the outsider. And that's what we found in actually working with this community to think about the redesign of a small public square in the heart of the historic city, that if the government was going to come and threaten the people with something, they would be united. But in the absence of an external threat, people tended to think of themselves. The coffee shop owner would think, oh, well, how can I increase the space for my tables so that I get more customers? The guy who has a dyeing workshop would think, well, what I need is parking space. But it was a very interesting process, partially because it reminded us that the users of space are not only the businesses around it, but also passers-by and others that are more invisible. And one of the things we found in our community survey was that the space was used by women, often getting into the house or kind of walking around, but because there was a coffee shop on this side of the square, they never walked by the coffee shop, because the coffee shop had what they would call foreign men. They weren't really foreign, but they meant that they're people not from the neighborhood, people who work there but don't live there. So the women would always walk on this side of the square to get to the other side, and basically so that the people at the coffee shop wouldn't see them or wouldn't kind of tease them or kind of. So one of the things we did, we had to factor into the design is that although our initial intention was to create a walkway on this side of the square, we realized that there needed to be some kind of passageway far away from the cafe so that it wouldn't make the women of the neighborhood feel uncomfortable at seeing these men craftsmen sitting at and looking at them as they came back from their shopping errands. And here are just some views of the square. And here you can see this is the coffee shop with places for people to sit, and the kind of, even though it's public, it's also private. That it's interesting how you can feel invisible in certain places even though everyone can see you. And this is what the women of this neighborhood wanted, the ability to feel that no one was actually looking at them. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been interesting in historic Cairo over the past decade is a growing interest among young people in the historic city as a place, a recreational space. This is, all these people behind are on one tour of historic Cairo. But in general, if you go in the evenings, you find that there are more young people sitting at cafes, playing the guitar, socializing. They may not know much about the history of the city or its buildings, but they appreciate the fact that in this case, the government has invested a lot of money in making the environments more appealing and removing cars and making it a more pedestrian-friendly space. Like this example. And one of the things that's happened in Egypt in the past 8 to 9 years is that there's been a drop in international tourism. But in the historic city, one of the things that seems to have made up for it is a rise, an increase in the number of Caireans who aren't necessarily from the historic city going there at night and enjoying it. So tourism in a different way. Yeah, public space can take very unusual forms, not just a rocky outcrop in Yemen that I showed you. I thought this was a really interesting example of, this is Tehran, a bridge that was constructed a few years ago by a young Iranian architect in Tehran. And she designed it not just as a connector between two sides of a valley, but as a public space where people could appreciate great views and linger. And I think it's the kind of space that appeals to many people today. If you think of the High Line in New York, it's a very similar idea of a space that is attractive but also takes you somewhere, but where you don't have to kind of rush from one side to the other. So it's transport on one hand, but on the other hand it isn't. And I thought it was an interesting, if you look at the photos of, I mean, it's quite a long bridge, so it appeals to young Iranians, also to take selfies and to look at the view, and in a way it reminded me of what people wrote about Shah Abbas's green space in the 16th century. It fulfills the same function but in a really contemporary way. Public space has also been used to reflect identity. And most of the time, I mean, when you look at great historic cities in the Islamic world and in other places, there's a conscious investment into what do we want our public space to look like, how is it going to reflect what we are and how we want people to see us. In this case, this is the Palestine Museum in Birzeit. And one of the things that's really interesting about the museum is not just the building itself, but the landscape. Because the landscape, which is vast, was designed with, it's cultivated with all of the herbs and the trees and the plants that have been part of Palestinian culture and cuisine. And it's a way of capturing identity in public space through plants, which I thought was a really ingenious and sensitive way of enabling people to think about who they are and how they link to nature and to a place, not as a built place, but as the natural environment. And I'll end where I began in Tatarstan, the Russian Republic, with this really huge scheme in which they invested in 328 public spaces at different scales and sizes. One of the things that the person in charge of doing this project said so eloquently is that when we work with the community, it's never really about design. We don't tell the community, okay, hold the pen and tell us what kind of bench you want. It's about working through ideas and thinking about what does the community need, what does it want, what's it lacking, and then going away and designing something that meets those needs. So it's participatory, but it doesn't mean that everyone's going to be a designer. And I read an interesting article about this project that said, it was a critical article that said, well, actually, this huge investment in public space is a way of the government trying to show that it's making a difference, but when it can't rectify all of the social problems of the country. And someone said, well, actually, in a way, we know that, around the world, we can't always solve political problems, but at least in having public spaces where we can come together, meet, relax, have activities, it gives us something that will last and will outlast whatever political system is in power. So I thought it was a good example to end with about the importance of public space, using a very ambitious scheme in Tataristan. Thank you.